Every day that passes without a mushroom cloud is a victory. We don't appreciate how much of a victory that is. But if you accumulate daily victories over years and decades, you've got yourself a norm. And it's a norm that's very hard for any leader to break.
That's the voice of Michael Krepon, who is the co-founder and senior fellow at the Stimson Center. His latest book is titled Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace: The Rise, Demise, and Revival of Arms Control. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Michelle Dover. Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, the Olympics are here. What is your favorite Olympic winter sport?
Michelle, great to see you again, and thanks for the question. You know, I have not been a good Olympic sport watcher. I don't actually get NBC. So I'm trying to figure out ways to see the highlights after the fact, sort of trying to sneak them on YouTube or something. But what I want to see, and which I love seeing every year, is when they do the snowboard races where they're side by side. It adds a whole dimension to it that I just find really interesting and which not many Olympic sports do. So that's mine. How about yours?
Mine is probably the giant slalom skiing. I love watching them fly, and like the skittering skis you hear on like the ice. It's like, oh my God, that's terrifying, exhilarating, and I love it. But we're here not to talk about the Olympics, but to talk about all things nuclear and national security. So first things first, I want to remind the audience that the request for proposals that Plowshares launched last fall, the deadline for that is next week, February 15th. So please, 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 if you have an idea that you think should get funded, go to our website, www.plowshares.org, and submit it. Tom, what do you have for us on nuclear news?
A couple of things on the Ukraine front. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, warned over the weekend that a possible Russian invasion could be imminent. They've been saying that for a while. It's interesting that the Ukrainians keep saying, oh no, it's not a crisis. Stop panicking our people. So as our listeners on this podcast know, we've had guests on like Stephen Pfeiffer, former ambassador to Ukraine, who've said, it's really up to the Russian president. And until we know what the Russian president thinks, we just don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine. On the Iran front, U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, Rob Malley, is expected to return to Vienna this week for the next round of talks. The U.S. restored some sanctions waivers, which is a hopeful sign, and we'll stay tuned to what comes out of Vienna. And last week, President Putin and President Xi of China met in Beijing ahead of the opening ceremony of the Olympics, where they pledged no limits on Russia-China ties and support for Russia's effort to limit NATO expansion. And lastly, just a couple of fact checks of things that just sort of have gotten under my craw that we've seen in the news lately. The New York Times wrote a story about how some in Ukraine are regretful of the fact that they gave nuclear weapons back to Russia. As our listeners will remember, at the end of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union broke up, 3 Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, had Russian nuclear weapons, Soviet nuclear weapons on their territory, and quite a large number of them, in fact. Kazakhstan gave them up. Belarus did the same. Ukraine held on to theirs for a while after that, considering whether they should keep them. And to set this record straight, I just wanted to remind people that at the time it was next near impossible for Ukraine to actually hold on to those nuclear weapons because they didn't have the infrastructure, they didn't have the nuclear codes, they didn't have any way to use or launch or modify those weapons. So it really was kind of a theoretical discussion of their ability to keep them. In fact, it was never really that realistic. And so these thoughts that if Ukraine could have kept them, they could have had a deterrent now against Russia, to me, are not that realistic. The other thing that I've been noticing, there was a Wall Street Journal story talking about how the Iran deal, if the United States and Iran and their partners can get back into it, will no longer deliver the 12-month breakout period that was promised long ago by the Obama administration. And therefore, asking the question, is the deal still in the U.S. interest to pursue? couple of points on that. One, while it's true that we're not going to get back to the 12-month breakout period, that's due to advances that Iran has made since the Trump administration withdrew from the deal. And as we have long said, that was a tragic mistake, and that is the problem here. But having said that, a 6 or 9 month breakout period is still much better than 0, which is where we'll be without a deal. And it's still enough time for a response, diplomatic or otherwise. And finally, as we've said on this podcast before, even after a breakout period, which, by the way, is just the time it would take Iran to acquire enough fissile material for one bomb, Iran would still need 1 to 2 years to develop the warhead that could be mated on a missile. So, from all those perspectives, that helps explain why the Biden administration is still pursuing a deal, which from our perspective is the way better alternative compared to no deal. And lastly, regarding Ukraine, today on Earlier Warning, I sit down with Anatol Lieven, a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute, to discuss the U.S. and NATO's responses to Russia's demands and possible diplomatic solutions for ending the crisis.
And Tom, if I could just add, it's been really interesting to watch how, interesting is maybe the wrong word, a little terrifying in some ways to watch how things are unfolding with Ukraine. Next week we are going to have Takshin Kasinova on the podcast to talk about her book about Kazakhstan's history with the bomb and how the decision to give it up, even though in hindsight, as you said, it makes a ton of sense. You can't, maintain these arsenals. It was hotly debated, and it was not as smooth and linear of a path as we remember. So not to say that the outcome wouldn't have been the same, but just, these were very grave questions that they wrestled with. You're all going to have to tune in for that. So in terms of the main interview for today, I sit down with Michael Krepon, the co-founder and senior fellow at the Stimson Center, to discuss his latest book, Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace, The Rise, Demise, and Revival of Arms Control. His book gives a comprehensive look at arms control. I highly recommend it. It's very easy to read in that sense. It moves along really quickly. I think it couldn't have come at a better time as we're really wrestling with these questions of how you can use diplomacy, what it means to have diplomacy with teeth to make us safer, and in a moment where it's hard to get treaties, how our community can go about pushing for further reductions. So stay tuned.
I look forward to that interview as well. I haven't read Michael's book, but I plan to. And in the meantime, I'm looking forward to the interview. And as usual, dear listener, if you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. The Ukraine crisis continues to unfold as the Pentagon announced it will send additional troops to Eastern Europe, where Russian troops remain near the Ukrainian border. Meanwhile, the search for an alternative to war marches on, and we now have a better understanding of the Biden administration's diplomatic approach thanks to newly leaked documents. To help us better understand the situation is Anatol Lieven. He's a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the author of the book Ukraine and Russia, A Fraternal Rivalry. Anatol, thanks so much for being here.
Hello.
So Anatol, we now have the U.S. and NATO responses to Russia's demands on Ukraine and European security. What do they tell us?
The NATO response we can just ignore. It's just bloviating stuff about how wonderful NATO is. And NATO really has no say, ultimately, in the agreements. The important thing is the Biden administration response. And while pretty firm on certain things, I found it relatively encouraging. It's diplomatically phrased, unlike the NATO document, so it doesn't, go out of its way to hurl abuse or reproaches at Russia. And it indicates a willingness to talk about one of the main Russian demands, which is limits on the deployment of new NATO forces close to Russia's borders. And it talks about reopening nuclear arms reduction talks. It talks about limiting offensive weapons in Ukraine and mutual controls, checks on the deployment of such weapons. So all of that, it gives the Russian government, the opportunity to claim that the talks are making progress and Russia has, is gaining something out of it, which is very important. On the other key Russian demand, which is ruling out NATO membership for Ukraine, the Biden administration document once again says that the United States and NATO can't do that. However, it does not actually explicitly rule out, it says nothing about it, a proposal which has been put forward that perhaps there could be a moratorium on NATO membership for Ukraine of, say, 10 years, 15 years, while, we try to sort out, all the problems connected with this. Now, this would not actually sacrifice anything on behalf of the West, because nobody, not even, the most ardent proponents of Ukraine's membership in NATO, think that this can take place in 15 years' time. It's not going to happen. But as I say, the US document doesn't say anything about that, but at least it doesn't rule it out. The other encouraging thing there is that it talks about, in very vague terms, the possibility of wider new security consultations. And it talks about our different understandings of these. But that leaves open at least the possibility, of course, this would be a very long-term process, of talks, intended to bring Russia into consultations about European security developments and European security crises. Now, as Thomas Graham, former senior US diplomat in Moscow and one of the top guys on Russia in the Bush administration, has suggested, if you could create, a new security architecture involving Russia, that would open the way to the solution of some of the conflicts or frozen conflicts going on around Europe, on the basis of two things. One is quid pro quos. I mean, obviously, if we were to recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea, Russia would have to recognize the independence of Kosovo. But also, we could perhaps aim at common democratic standards there, which, of course, would also force us to recognize that a majority of the population in Crimea, as in South Ossetia and one or two places, actually wants to be with Russia. We would have to eat some crow. The Russians would have to eat some crow over Kosovo. Now that's, for the moment, that is all quite hypothetical, but at least the US response does not close off these possible developments. And it would seem that the Putin administration also thinks this and, is willing to use this as a basis for further negotiations. By the way, the Biden administration has now said, intelligence has said, the immediate threat of war has receded. It hasn't gone away, but it has receded again. By the way, what this also indicates is, there were so many people in Washington who will never, of course, correct themselves or admit they were wrong, who said that, the Russian demands to NATO in the US were intended to be rejected so that Russia would have a pretext for war. Well, that is clearly not the case. If that had been the case, Russia would have gone to war already. It hasn't. So obviously on both sides, there is, a willingness to negotiate. Now, they're still, of course, a long way from each other, but there is, I think, some hope. The other positive thing is that the French and Germans have agreed to reopen the Normandy format talks on a peace settlement for eastern Ukraine on the basis of autonomy within Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians appear to be in the process of rejecting that, but, at least it indicates there is some, European will now to make a contribution to solving this crisis.
Now, the steps that have been outlined by the United States in its response to Russia, do you think they're enough to satisfy Russia, and how do you see this crisis ending?
Well, the military steps that have been taken by the United States are, of course, purely symbolic. I mean, these are steps against Russia, to send, is it 2,000 troops, or is it 3,000, with another 5,000 standing by? I mean, this is totally symbolic because they're being sent to countries that Russia has no intention of attacking, and by the way, has never threatened to attack on any occasion. Poland and Romania. Baltic states, slightly different, but even so, there have been no Russian threats to the Baltic states recently. The best thing from my point of view about these troop deployments is that the US can withdraw them again as part of an agreement with Russia. So they could be, military bargaining counters, which is great, or would be great. As far as the wider situation is concerned, look, any talks will take, I think, a very long time if they are to reach any kind of comprehensive solution. What is happening at present, though, there is a possibility that the West will come to a clearer understanding of the fact that it is Ukraine that is blocking a peace settlement in the Donbass. Now, of course, if the Ukrainians implemented the essential terms, we'd have to see whether Russia followed suit or not. If it didn't, then there would be obviously no peace agreement. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, and the Pentagon is certainly well aware of this, is the fact that things could happen elsewhere in the world which would lead the United States to try to make real efforts to reduce tension with Russia. Things can happen in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. Things can happen with China. Really, the kind of core blobbists, if you like, in Washington are beginning to acknowledge America is now very seriously overstretched. By the way, I mean, the whole idea of NATO membership for Ukraine is, completely ridiculous. Nobody actually takes it seriously. I'm not sure even the Russians take it seriously as it stands, as opposed to, an indication of the West's sort of political aggressiveness. Because, of course, to defend Ukraine against Russia would require a serious American army, a Cold War-style American army, 100,000 American troops for Ukraine, backed by a large part of the US Air Force. And please don't tell me that the Europeans are going to contribute anything serious to this. Even the ones who would loyally turn up, like the Brits. The British Army now has 2 brigades that it can deploy. And probably actually only one of those immediately. They're just not in a position to do something. As for the Germans going back to Ukraine with the possibility of fighting the Russians, the Germans have not forgotten that they lost more than 3.5 million men on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. I don't think that they want to get into that again. As far as I can see, the only country other than some Ukrainians who would welcome a US move like that would be China. The Pentagon is extremely well aware of that. And, that is why any suggestion of the merest hint of the US offering to defend Ukraine, has been promptly vetoed by the US military.
Anatol, thank you so much. We're going to have to end it there, but I really appreciate your time and best of luck in all your work.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Deputy Director of Development at Plowshares Fund and a Press the Button listener. When I first joined Plowshares Fund back in 2018, I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I came here with just the motivation to help create a safer world and a commitment to lifelong learning. My colleagues told me they'd teach me everything I need to know, and did they ever? Still do, actually. As I continue to grow ever more committed to Plowshares Fund and the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, I found that I rely on Press the Button so much. It's a resource for the latest analysis and a place where I can drop in fully, without distractions, and gain new insight into this issue I've come to know and love. I find inspiration from the weekly guests and our partners, and I know I'm a better contributor to our cause just by tuning in. Please consider supporting Plowshares Fund and helping make Press the Button possible by making a donation today. Visit plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
The need for arms control has never been more vital. China has been rapidly expanding its nuclear capabilities, and there is a doubt that we will be able to successfully revive the JCPOA. The United States and Russia maintain thousands of weapons in their arsenal and, like many other countries, are spending billions, if not trillions of dollars to modernize them. To discuss a revival and reimagination of arms control, I'm joined today by Michael Krepon, who is the co-founder and a senior fellow at the Stimson Center. Many of you may know Michael. He's been on the show before and has a deep expertise in our field. He is the author of the new book, Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace: The Rise, Demise, and Revival of Arms Control. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Michelle, thank you for asking.
First of all, congratulations on your book. I know you say it's not intended to be comprehensive, but it covers exactly what the title says. from the beginning to the current day of arms control and how it's evolved over the course of that history. What prompted you to write it?
I'm getting old, Michelle, and I felt compelled to provide a history. What happened? If we don't know our history, then it's really harder to find our footing and to find the future. So there was a strange need for a history of nuclear arms control. There really hasn't been one.
I'm going to dive straight into some of your arguments and your findings in the book. You talk about throughout the book that if a nuclear weapon is used, it will be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to control the escalatory cycle that follows, despite the amount of effort that experts and planners put into identifying ways to do exactly that. And your argument is that the only real way to prevent the use of nuclear weapons is to adopt a norm of no use, prioritize nonproliferation efforts, and lean into arms control measures. How did you arrive at these three principles as being the most important?
Our perspectives about this work, Michelle, are baked into when we enter the field, our personal experiences, where we work. And it's hard for our thinking to evolve about remedies, because typically when we fix on a remedy, we're good for life on that remedy. And some remedies are absolutely essential. They're timeless. But when I entered the field, Michelle, to answer your question, the big thing was treaties. And arms control and disarmament was treaty-based. I worked in the Carter administration, and we banged our heads against the wall to ratify the SALT II treaty, which eventually didn't happen because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And treaty ratifications became harder and harder for democratic presidents. And now, with the country so deeply divided and with partisanship run amok on Capitol Hill, how do you get 67 votes? My thinking evolved. And if we can't get it done by treaties, we can get it done by norms. And the wonderful thing about norms, Michelle, is that you can win every day. Every day that passes without a mushroom cloud is a victory. We don't appreciate how much of a victory that is. But if you accumulate daily victories over years and decades, you've got yourself a norm. And it's a norm that's very hard for any leader to break.
I actually think that the successes of the field in some way are really underrated. The number of weapons that used to be in existence to where we are now, for example, the number of near misses or tense situations that we have navigated through. And you emphasize this in your book. It's not just luck. It's also talented negotiators and talented policymakers who helped get us through. So I guess my question is, how can we get to a norm of no use if actors continue to see nuclear weapons and their ability to be used as deterrence and something that is worth investing in?
Just to reaffirm what you said, Michelle, when I was your age, there were 30 to 40,000 nuclear weapons in this world. Now we got 13,000 or so, a terribly high number, but we have made so much progress that we lose sight of. If we focus on the norm of no use, whoever uses a nuclear weapon for the first time since 1945 in warfare becomes the worst enemy of humanity, will live in infamy for the remainder of human history. If we just hammer away at the leader that crosses this threshold and entertains crimes against humanity and nature. Just drive that point home over and over again. We strengthen the norm. We also strengthen the norm every day by not having nuclear weapons being used in warfare. And this already is the hardest norm to break because it's over 7 decades old. We also hammer away at the norm of not testing nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons tests are an affirmation of military utility. That's why they're tested. And that's why we refuse to accept the resumption of testing. And by the way, every major power and every regional power have now not tested for over 2 decades. We can do this. We can win. We can win every single day on no use and no testing.
How do you think about the non-nuclear elements, but technologically relevant, the ones like missile defense, like cyber warfare, that can make it more appealing for a leader to actually consider using nuclear weapons?
The things you've mentioned, Michelle, are substitutes for using nuclear weapons. If there is uncontrolled escalation, they will lead to nuclear weapons use. If there is no escalation control, we're talking about crimes against humanity and nature. And there's nothing about nuclear deterrence that addresses escalation control. Nuclear deterrence is all about the threat of escalation. It's all about seeking advantage and seeking to avoid disadvantage. And you strengthen deterrence in this manner. But guess what? If deterrence fails and the nuclear threshold is crossed, the very instruments that deterrence strategists rely on for deterrence are also the very same instruments that lead to uncontrolled escalation and crimes against humanity, crimes against nature. That's why the nuclear threshold is so central to everything we do. We protect. We are offended by the prospect of nuclear use. And we're going to make life miserable for those who think, oh, just a little bit, We're going to cross the threshold. Now, the question becomes, Michelle, and this is where you and I may have a difference. Where does the no first use incantation come into all this? I know so many of my colleagues believe deeply that the words matter so much. The words need to be embraced. The words are less important to me than actions. And the words may not be believable or credible, and they can certainly be changed as administrations change. So we may differ about this. I'm not into the words, no first use. I obviously support it and believe in it, but the words that I think are way more effective in political debate is no use, period.
Words can easily be changed, and I think at this point, countries around the world are looking at the Biden administration and not just looking at what they're going to put on paper, but they're looking at what programs the administration is funding in terms of modernization, looking at their other actions around the world, and trying to figure out where that leaves them, not just for this administration, but for whatever administrations follow. So I agree on that. I do think, though, that taking the victories where you can of embracing this, at least starting with the statement that we will not use nuclear weapons first, is incredibly important, particularly in the context of the polarization in the United States, in the risks that we're seeing, the rising threats around the world. So I have a question for you, though, because you sparked my interest on this when you said where you stand, it somewhat is shaped by how you entered the field, when you entered the field, and it's hard to change perspectives. Was there anything during your research and writing process that you found something that surprised you?
What doesn't surprise me is that my memory is spotty and selective. So a lot of things I had forgotten. But the president who surprised me the most was a president I reviled, Lyndon Baines Johnson. I was an anti-war activist. I was a student organizer, teach-ins and all the rest. And Johnson drove me nuts. And the more I read into him and his administration in our field, I mean, I know he did amazing things on civil rights and voting rights and the Great Society and domestic issues. I knew he was astounding, despite the war in Vietnam. But I forgot how much he did in arms control. Lyndon Baines Johnson was instrumental in the Outer Space Treaty. He was instrumental in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. These are two foundational treaties in our world. And he set the stage for the strategic arms limitation talks. He couldn't get them started. He really wanted to. But the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, big setback. And so strategic arms control was delayed until the Nixon administration.
Going back to point one, when I say that I think this was more comprehensive than you modestly say it is, I really hope that listeners read the whole thing. I have another question for you. We've talked a lot about policymakers, those who can make the decisions, and not as much about the public. And how, there's been a decline, right, in public awareness of a nuclear threat since the Cold War. At this point, almost a mantra that the field repeats to itself. The public memory of the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the extent that the public knew about it, due to the censorship and attempts to prevent that information from getting out, has lessened over time. What do you think can increase the sense of public awareness and urgency around the nuclear threat or to political leaders without the use of another nuclear weapon or, as you talk about in the book, an experience like the Able Archer exercise in 1983 that brought us to the brink?
I think that a deep crisis will raise public awareness. And hopefully that crisis, and there are so many possibilities right now, a crisis can re-energize our field and our national leaders on Capitol Hill to focus again on first principles. I really do think it will help to focus on first principles. What does nuclear peace look like? Those two words don't go together. So I use them, of course, in the title of my book, because you know what? At the end of the Cold War, we had all of the functioning elements of nuclear peace in hand, and we dropped the ball in so many different ways. And Vladimir Putin dropped the ball in so many different ways. So nuclear peace, first principles, no use, no testing. We have to focus again on the avoidance of dangerous military practices. That's such an important element of nuclear peace. And arms control helped do that during the Cold War. We still had dangerous practices. There are much fewer of them. I'm nearing the end of my years. And I think of the time I've spent in this field. It's almost biblical in the sense that there are lean years, and then there are very full years, years full of accomplishment. And we're now living in lean years because primarily of domestic division in the United States, and because two of the three biggest players, Russia and China, are unhappy with the status quo, and that leads to nuclear danger. What I want to say for people who are younger than me is that there will be full years in the future. I can't predict when they will happen. This business is so strange because it's always darkest before the dawn. So we don't know when conditions will again be in place where we can make tremendous progress. I don't want people to lose heart. When we're in lean years, that's the time we need to think hard about strategy and tactics. That's the time to come up with new terms of reference, new frameworks for how we wish to proceed. This is the time when we check on our language, on the words that we're so attached to see if they really resonate. This is the time to get ready for achievement in the future. And don't lose heart.
When you were going through those dark nights of the soul, as I think the Catholics would call them, how did it feel to transition into those years of movement? Was it something that you felt like you were able to influence, you either individually or as a field? Or was it something that you felt like it just happened to you?
Our community is the generator of good ideas. We're the ones, the deterrence strategists come up with a new warhead for a tactical nuclear weapon. We come up with practical ideas to help us get from here to there. It was our community that came up with the idea of on-site inspections. And we were rejected roundly, not just by the Kremlin, but by the Pentagon. Everything wonderful that happened from the second Reagan administration through the end of the first term of the Clinton administration, amazing accomplishments, were advanced by on-site inspections. Okay, what about how do we strengthen and lengthen norms? What are the techniques that we can put in our kit bag on this? What haven't we thought through? What do we need to rethink? How do we advance norms? Because listen, I believe that as dark as the sky looks right now, if we can succeed every day without mushroom clouds on battlefields, without nuclear testing, and without further proliferation, all three are achievable. If we can continue to succeed day by day, and we succeed all the way up to the 100th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's my goal. It's an achievable goal. The hardest part is actually behind us. The hardest part happened because of previous generations working this problem. We can do this. No tests, no mushroom clouds, no more proliferation till 2045. You tell me what the world's going to look like in 2045. Would you expect nuclear arsenals to continue to grow or to shrink? Would you expect first use? Or would you expect that it's extremely hard after a century of non-use for somebody to pull the trigger? The world we can pass on to, in your case, Michelle, your kids, in my case, my grandkids, will be a world of significantly reduced nuclear dangers just by focusing on norms.
I think we're going to end on that really hopeful note, which is not something I feel like we often do in this field. Michael, thank you so much for joining. Where can listeners go to read your book?
You can go to stanforduniversitypress.edu.
I highly encourage our listeners to go check it out. Michael, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Mitchell, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shane. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.